Thanks again for having me here. I prefer to present in English because it's been a while since my Italian has been, I don't know, I don't use it very often, so maybe it's better if I use English and explain myself more correctly. Before going into the presentation, maybe I can share with you the details and the reasons why I started to work on the refugee camps in Africa. I was working on a book that will be published in the spring, next spring, 2022. Its title is War Diaries, Design After Destruction of Art and Architecture. And I was very interested in urban reconstruction after the war. But I realized that in contexts that are known Western ones, this was not only the case of what happened after war and after destruction. So I became interested in refugee camps that actually hosts millions of people, especially in Africa, try to flee conflicts, wars. So the focus of this presentation in particular is the design of Hagadera, which is a camp near the Somali border in the desert of Kenya. Hagadera is one of 3 original camps forming the Dadaab refugee complex. The other 2 camps, you have a small map here, are Ifo, the first original one, and Dagahaeli. Together, these 3 camps constitute the site of a United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees complex, a complex that hosts 220,000 registered refugees, registered asylum seekers. This is the data from July 2020. We need to remember that many of them are also unregistered, so the number is much higher than this, even if officially is around 200,000. So to remember, in 1991, 1.5 million Somalis fled persecution during a civil war, and 400,000 asylum seekers crossed the international border as the crisis was compounded by drought and famine. So the government of Kenya offered to host the refugees with major assistance from the United Nations, and it provided a site for a transitional settlement near Dadaab. Dadaab is a village of 5,000 people on the highway between Mogadishu and Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. It's an unpaved highway. We are in the desert. So the first camp was established in October 1991. Hagadera followed in May 1992. We have considerable important material written, shared on Dadaab. Journalists, researchers, scholars, but even photographers, filmmakers, they can visit the refugee camps in Kenya after obtaining a visa, after obtaining a letter of approval from the government. However, despite this, not much has been said on the design in itself of the camps. So nowadays, these settlements, especially Hagadera, well, they resemble naturally grown towns, and they have developed into commercial hubs connecting northeastern Kenya and southern Somalia. So how did the design occur? Which were the main objectives of these plans for the Dadaab camps? Where, for example, the provision of public spaces like a market or this almost, let's say, spontaneous character of the current settlement, 2 of the main objectives pursued by the planner, by the architect who made the original designs? These are some of the questions that I tried to answer during my research. It was in May 1992 that Per Ivansson, a Swedish architect and planner, arrived in Dadaab to design the Hagadera refugee camp. The settlement had to be ready to receive 30 to 40,000 refugees within a month after the arrival of the architect. After 2 weeks of surveys, Ivansson and his planning team had been able to draw only a detailed map of the area. So the architect had merely 2 more weeks to elaborate his final design that you have here and prepare the camp to receive the first refugees. So when we reconsider today 30 years after its application. When we reconsider today Higginson's rapid but efficient design process, we can understand his peculiar characterization of the refugee camp as non finito. He didn't go into details on everything in his plan. He didn't want to control everything with his design, and this was done on purpose, not only because of a lack of time. At the same time, we can understand how his design shows a desire to challenge the idea of the camp as an exceptional, inherently precarious landscape. So this presentation is focused on Higginson's ideas of non finito, indeterminacy, and his interest in open design and the unfinished in the refugee camp, more in general. As I said, temporary settlements receiving people forced to leave their country have been studied from, for example, a geopolitical, a demographic, a medical, but even an economic perspective, at least since after World War II. Here you have the definition of a term refugee by the UN, developed around 1951. So the literature on international humanitarian relief is vast. And it teaches us that a lot can be intelligently managed, planned ahead of time in humanitarian relief. But we need to remember to manage is not to design, as we as architects or planners even understand. So when it comes to humanitarian design, more in details, the situation, the literature is less clear. The United Nations provide many tools to inform the designers of emergency settlements and architecture. This is the Handbook for Emergencies, developed in 1982 for the first time. Now it is at its 4th edition. It's online now. It's a tool that continues to impact on practices and standards as a sort of guidebook directed field activity. Read today, the handbook provides information on design, which are, however, mainly focused on general, very general site planning for camps, camp planning standards, shelter solution, and here you have a screenshot on that. There is not much about the process of design itself and the principles to guide it. Additional design documents by the United Nations include the Shelter Design Catalog. Again, you have an image here. A document that presents applied examples of shelter and settlement designs that architects and planners should refer to. Another tool, the Shelter Projects 2017-18. This one was written by practitioners to help other designers to understand what worked and what didn't work in previous shelter responses. But as the previous tools, this document as well, this demonstrates a lack of depth in design research and history of design. Its main declared expectation, which is, and it's quoted in the introduction, it's learning from the past so that we can better respond in the future. Well, this expectation is dramatically failed, as the document includes only cases from a recent past, 2017, 2018. As if good practices dealing with emergency, dealing with design could not be found in a, let's say, less recent past. So despite the central role that design has played in the development of the humanitarian project, you have an example here from 41, architecture and planning have often been relegated to disciplines at the service of the emergency. They have been considered let's say, areas of expertise unable, in a way, to question, challenge the very ideas behind the construction of the camp. So as a result, not much has been uncovered on how architects, planners like Higginson in Agadera have engaged the field of international humanitarian relief, and what has been the development of their approach to designing the refugee camp. So the problem with current spatial models and contemporary graphic tools have often been, my opinion, their rigidity. The fact that they suggest prescriptive rather than descriptive principles. These tools increase tendencies that assert standardized guidelines in a top-down way. So these models read as instructions more than, I would say, suggestions to reflect upon, and they have inevitably led to oversimplification in the design of the refugee camp. So has the history of camps, their failures, unfortunately, have been teaching us reductionism, functionalism, and to dictate an almost absolute control over the camp's environment. And this means that the control is absolute also over the lives of the refugees. An example of these rigid design principles that poses a normative risk is the grid. Many camps have developed following its basic design. Hagadera is among them. So that we have orthogonal grids that allow easy length subdivision, easy surveying, quick implementation in urgent situations. Grids are a very useful system. They favor accessibility, efficient distribution of resources, easy spatial orientation, easy wayfinding. Grids have been critical tools, especially in high-density camps. Hagadera is defined as the world's largest refugee camp. So these are places where humanitarian workers need to quickly locate places, need to quickly, rapidly redistribute resources. However, behind the narrative of functionality, efficiency, grids layout with its military colonial savoir, this layout also promotes systemic control, systemic division. The history of the grid in urban design goes back at least to the Roman practice of centuriazione and the first plans by Ippodamo da Mileto, responsible, by the way, according to Aristotle, of segregating, dividing the population into groups according to their skills. The colonial history of Africa and the Americas, you have an example here from the US. This history confirms the ideological and utopian social power, let's say, enmeshed in the design of the grid-shaped city. So the dividing capability of the grid is especially dangerous when replicated in the refugee camp. Here, plans that do not take into consideration the danger of isolating, controlling, dividing refugee groups would have devastating results on the lives of people living in the camps. Refugees have already been forced to leave their country, to escape war, persecution, and natural disasters. They fled their homes, their cultural milieu, their traditions, leaving all behind, their group, their community included. So when they reach the camp, the last thing that they need is being further divided. Stevenson himself was interested in understanding how designers could balance the need for organization on one hand with living patterns that were more careful, sensitive to the needs of the refugee and their different groups on the other hand. So he built his research on the work of post-disaster architecture and urbanization. He studied shelter design and vulnerability, the work by architects such as Ian Davis, Frederick Cooney, and you have some of his examples here. During his experience in Dadaab, in Agadera, he became progressively interested also in ideas of flexibility and transformation as applied to the design of the camp and even its grade. So adaptation, openness to change, improvisation, in a way, are all characteristics that, in his opinion, could address the growth and futurity, the future of the camp, even while using a grid system. So only this idea of non finito could address and retain the livability of the refugee camp, even after decades from its initial design. So even a grid system of blocks, if in a way adapted to local physical and cultural circumstances, well, this system could accommodate subsequent transformations and answer to multiple community needs. So his work in Agadera suggests that the adoption of universal standards and rigid systems alone would not guarantee similar effective results. Only through indeterminacy, the unfinished in time, unfinished in space, the camp could overcome technocratic determination and establish in a way its own specific horizon. Evenson's work specialized in solving spatial emergencies within multifaceted cultural frameworks and contexts. He worked for the United Nations to design settlements in Kenya, starting with this camp in Valda, but he also worked in Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Bosnia, Sri Lanka. At times, this work translated in a silent battle against bureaucratic universal ICAM's knowledge, such as the one provided by the UN and its pamphlets, the documents that I show you. We need to remember he was not a member of the country hosting the refugees in Agadera, nor a member of the communities escaping war and famine. He was, as it's often happened, an international expert and international consultant. So as an outsider, visiting Agadera for the first time in '92, Evenson was faced with the urgency of moving from scrubland to refugee camp in only a few weeks. And to solve the issue, first, he covered a vast area on foot to survey the future camp. So his planning team included only one Kenyan surveyor, John Kariuki, who helped him draw a detailed map of the location. The work in the field allowed Evenson and his collaborator to identify the best areas where to plan the settlement. According to the architect, it was necessary to examine the morphology of the place where the camp was supposed to be, and it was necessary to talk with local people. And I'm quoting, to understand their uses of space and their relationship to the plan. So in this interview from 2018, he recalls that while he was in Valda, another refugee area in Canada, I show you the plan for Valda that he developed, he had immersed himself in the local climate, in the local community. And I'm quoting again, I started walking all over the camp, and then I drove a car and kept measuring distances, making observations, driving, and then walking again. I spent a week walking around among the refugees, trying to figure out how the spontaneous place worked. So the design process began in a similar way in Agadera. He walked and talked to people. There, Evenson positioned himself against the idea of a top-down, unidirectional approach to humanitarian design. He developed a design narrative that involved local professionals, local inhabitants, and it was the only possible narrative to guide the process of initial design, but also provide structural organization and at the same time support the spontaneous, let's say, the future development of camp's spatiality. So why is this idea of futurity so important in the design of a refugee camp? Care is, of course, central to humanitarianism. Humanitarian organizations and institutions defend an idea of universal humanity. And it's an idea that cares for individuals, but in a way removes them from their collectivity. Humanitarianism provides care in limited situations. It does not support, for example, long-term human status as much as its design, humanitarian design, does not provide long-term housing. So humanitarian responses, their specific focus on emergency and the short-term horizon, while these responses do not concentrate on long-standing inequality, the future, in a way, of the refugee camp. And in protracted refugee situations, like those in Agadera, the reality of the temporality of the camp results as something very different from what humanitarianism theorizes. Numerous thousands of people have been living since the 90s in the camp. Children and grandchildren are born in the camp, and they have not known any other places than the camp. So Evenson understood how the possibility to change camp's short-term condition came with the idea of non finito in design, that therefore was so important, it became so fundamental for the refugees living in Agadera. So the opportunity of transforming the camp during their time there meant that the refugees could, in a way, appropriate these places, use them for community purposes, rebuild our own identity as members of a new community, the community living in the camp. On one hand, the use of a grid system allowed Evenson to deliver in the urgency and exigency of humanitarian design. On the other hand, grid's implementation and transformation carried out by humanitarian organizations and the refugee of the camp allowed them to regain a social status. So here I overlapped the plan by Evenson's and the image from Google Earth. You can see that the plan is much, much smaller than what's the current contemporary settlement is. So the grid is a system that can be, of course, expanded. And this helped when the number of refugees increased. But there are other transformation that's happened to the original plan. So, for example, you see the grid here is divided by a central corridor, and here there are two more corridors. These were developed, designed actually by Evenson as empty spaces, but as you can see, they are now full of other activities, and we will see later what's happening in this originally empty space. So in an interview, again, the architect affirmed, and I'm quoting, "If there is a grid, it should ideally be disturbed. It should be altered by something, so it has its own identity." Main idea in Evenson design was to leave the grid, or at least sections of it, open for self-settlement, with no predetermined organization of individual parcels and lots. Again, here you have blocks, but only a very mild suggestion on how they could be developed. In Agadera, Evenson designed the block as the spatial reference unit of the plan. The block defined the streets networks, it defined the grid, but within each block, however, habitation emerged in different ways that adapted to local conditions, that adapted to the cultural diversity of the group living there. And here you have two very different examples. So as a result, when we re-examine today the camp, it presents blocks with different types of occupation, very specific character. So some blocks show it's sort of an unplanned lot created as the family started to spontaneously settle in and grow, and this is on your right. Other blocks have more traditional parcels on your left, with dwellings following the orthogonal order of the grid. Even when it comes to the dwellings chosen by the refugees or the humanitarian organization, we can see very, very different typologies. So we have what we can call the modern hut with a structure in wood, clay, very often by mud, and with a metal sheet as roof, which comes from a very well-known colonial tradition. And then we have, coexisting with this system, other different typologies. This comes from the traditional tukul, the traditional hut of people living in Somalia and Kenya. So we can suppose that the first dwellings here, the first houses, were these two buildings, and then other members joined the family, and the compound grew in time. So the rigid structure of the plan not only coexisted with spontaneous housing environments, we can also see that it has accommodated further changes and addition in the public sphere, for example, in the public corridors here, but also in the paths, in the streets in between road infrastructure, in the internal streets. in the blocks. These paths are the result of Evenson's unfinished design and its the spontaneous occupation of the space by local refugees. So as families settled in the camp, they created these new paths connecting the plots. So the parcels closer to the public space have also extended, as in this case, for example, they extended into the public space, accommodating different informal activities. This is one example. This is not a house, it's probably a stall, a place where something is sold. Some notes about humanitarianism. The forms of care that humanitarianism addresses are focused, as I said, on the short-term horizon of the emergency, and therefore provide limited social services, let's say. In architectural terms, this translates in minimal opportunities to design spaces allocated to social and cultural experience. Evenson fought the idea that camps' public spaces emerged only from what was left after the functional planning for the crisis had occurred. He sustained the design of public spaces for social activities since the beginning of his design process in Agadera. You see some of these spaces here, right? In the refugee camps context, well, we can say that the technical accounting of the urgency can very easily prevail. We have many examples of this from camps. But Evenson's project shows that it is possible to deal with the crisis by focusing on solving both space-time limitations and by paying attention to the rights of the people, to the life of the people in the camp. We need to remember that in ideal situations, the refugee camp should provide appropriate public services, needs-based healthcare services, educational infrastructures to mitigate what are defined vulnerabilities in the camp. In theory, the camp should also implement spaces for livelihood to favor income-generating activities for the refugees, even if this doesn't always happen. So the tools, the guidelines developed by the United Nations, well, they don't really help. They do not mention how to design these services, this public sphere, and they abandon in a way individual and institutional actors among the architects and local administrators to and alone research on the topic. So as I said before, the United Nations humanitarian administrative industry, its implementing partners, they do not accept the idea that camps could become more permanent entities, housing multicultural communities, which is however what has happened in many cases. The emergence of public space in the camp would favor the kind of social certification and complexity that leads to the creation of less transitional settlements for the displaced. At least from a legal perspective, the refugees experience the paradoxical condition that's called extraterritoriality. They are not inside nor outside the nation state that hosts them. So as they become refugees, they are stripped of all legal status, which means that they are not supposed to possess, for example, political bodies. So following this reasoning, according to the humanitarian industry, camps should not aim to provide the public space for politics, for example, to take place. Their developments, their design should not foresee political and practical self-determination for the communities living within their borders, nor should they envision in a way the provision of standards of permanent living as a first priority. But what if someone will live 30 years in a camp? So Evenson well understood the social-cultural complexity of some refugee camps. Agadera is among one of them. He understood how this situation asked for further discussion centered on the relation between camp spatiality and social and economic formations. Indeed, the camps of Dadaab do not currently constitute a city in legal terms, at least for the government of Kenya. they nevertheless present a well-organized informal economy, novel forms of political engagement, and international multicultural population. The camps, how they are collectively administered, even by the refugees, it recalls the peripheral urban settings of the megalopolis, the peripheries of the African city, for example. So if after the arrival of the refugees, the urgency of the emergency raises technical operational issues, and even some that with them in Agadera, once established, the camps grow and the relevant social complexity can emerge. It has local and more international ties. So as an example, in Dadaab town, as well as in its camps, there are local markets selling everything from goat meat, camel's milk. There are construction supplies, bed frames, mattresses, television, cell phones, etc. The markets in the camp look very similar to the market in Dadaab town. But because of the informal economy, because of the presence of international humanitarian workers, refugees can organize activities that do not take place in town, like, for example, exchanging local cash to US dollars. From a design perspective, architects, planners like Evenson need to respect quantitative standards to be able to calculate, for example, the space of people to queue for food distribution, or the administrative spaces needed by the various NGOs. However, as Evenson remember, and I'm quoting, spaces for other things that belong to normal life, which are less easy to quantify, must also be provided. Space for meetings, recreation, spaces for culture. So the humanitarian organizations that manage complex camps can expand their services in time, provide, for example, more schools, more hospitals. But when the most basic needs are met, refugees tend to work to enrich the social, cultural, and economic context in which they live. So in Agadera, the infrastructure of social services, the public corridors, the market, and you have an image here, they all bring evidence of this political, social, and economic, we can say, blossoming. During the initial planning phase, Evenson paid particular attention to the design of the green public corridors in between blocks, the administrative center right here, and the market in this area. To provide enough public space among shelters, Evenson included some main axes that served, as I said, as public corridors and connect blocks. They were initially designed and built as large empty streets, but they now accommodate several informal activities, as I show you. In architectural terms, this can translate in the presence of a stall, a bancarella, a simple roof, a simple gesture, which is, however, something so needed in the refugee camp in social and economic terms. In the administrative center, here, Evenson developed further the idea of the grid. So here the design adapted to local topography, the presence of water here, and right at the convergence of the water system and the access road, the grid in a way rotates. So here Evenson designed the administrative core. There is a petroleum station on one side of the access road, the administration, the administrative core with food distribution on the other side. There was also, as I said, a market here, and closer to the northeastern part of it, there are several paths leading to a library, two primary schools. There is a mosque in here. That emphasizes a sort of more central public space. The Agadera market, in particular, is very interesting. It includes a variety of shops. There are restaurants, bars, a dense network of walking paths. The design of this space is still unfinished. So after its initial development, in 92 in this area, the area has expanded to include these blocks and the space that Evenson left open for further developments in one of the corridors. And here it hosts the activities organized by, for example, sellers coming from all over Kenya, businessmen coming from the countryside to the camp. So Agadera and the other camps are centers of a vivid commercial activity growing out of private economy and people's capabilities and initiative. In particular, the market has become the most important hub center in northeastern Kenya, and it is connected by bus routes to Nairobi, the capital, but also Somalia and Ethiopia, and there are many bus routes that connects it to the other camps. So this emerging economy is informal, but creates jobs. Drivers, sellers of food, rations, butchers of camel meat, they are among the figures requested the most. As I said before, Evenson was aware of how the deployment of the grid could produce what was necessary for refugees in the short term. A stable organizational system that can help the humanitarian workers to quickly distribute resources and locate places. In the long term, the introduction of more flexible elements and, in a way, under-design, unfinished, I don't know how to call this very well, but under-design is probably not the best, but you understand what I mean. Under-design areas. So the design of this avoided to impose restrictions on refugees' social activities and on their abilities to generate livelihood. In a way, only the spatial non finito, open to change, transformation, has produced the public space needed by the refugees to develop more complex economic and social activities. It is precisely on this theme, on this topic, that designers can intervene and play an important role in settlement for the refugees. According to Evenson, and I'm quoting, the quality of any kind of town, even in the settlement for the refugee, relies on the quality of its public space, its street, its markets, what they consist of, and what they can offer. So more problematic than the use of a grid per se is the lack of enough and well-designed public spaces for the community of refugees. Spaces, and again, I'm quoting Evenson, where a street widens to become a public area. I want you to take a moment to look at this edge of the grid. It's all but an orthogonal grid here, right? Here the grid breaks to host the presence of a tree, for example. And these informal systems actually create a much more articulated public space with one small public space, a slightly larger one, and a bigger one. So it creates also a spontaneous hierarchy in the public space. So for decades, sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, you probably read Giorgio Agamben writing about this. They have been, interested in examining the paradox of the camp. The camp characterizes both the space of absolute separation and the dream of belonging to a space. Refugees are separated from their home communities, their groups, and sometimes even from their family members. However, they always dream to belong, to go back to their home country or to build a new permanent life somewhere else. Agadera is the perfect example of this absolute, pure biopolitical space. It's a space in which power can exercise a complete control over life and death. Refugees cannot enter, they cannot exit the camp as they please. Officially, they cannot have a job in Kenya. Food is given to them in ration, etc., etc., etc. So as I said, in addition to this, even when the refugees have a group in the camp, the investments behind the emergency response to humanitarian crisis remain grounded in the protection of the individual, not the community, nor the family, nor the group. So in other words, humanitarianism supports the idea of a humanity composed by a set of singular individuals dealing with exceptional circumstances. This in part explains the extensive contributions on the investigation, for example, on shelters, to the detriment of a research on the public space in the refugee camp. So the contradiction of living in the space of unmitigated segregation while dreaming to belong to a place has been rarely addressed by official humanitarian organizations. Writing and tools by the UN, they imply a vision of the camp as a sort of last opportunity, last resort that should be set up only when other solutions are neither feasible nor preferable. However, the problem is far from being easily solvable in this way. Numerous millions of people, not only Dadaab, still live and then have been living for decades in refugee camps. So to conclude, the theoretical, practical work by architects like Evenson introduces new prospects in a very controversial geopolitical history. This work invites design to initiate a critical discussion with politics that go well beyond mere survival in the camp. Evenson's approach in particular confronts with what we can call the permanence of the impermanent. It exposes false expectations of, we can say, ephemerality. And at the same time, it challenges the condition of the camp as a place of extreme hierarchy, extreme dehumanization. The case of Agadera offers examples of flexible design attitudes that focus on ideas of openness, non finito, as well as ethically engaged architectural modalities. Evenson did not idealize nor fetishize the condition of the refugee. He tried to recuperate the voice of local actors and acknowledge the importance of participatory processes, even in the very short time he had produced his design, only 4 weeks. So he considered this to be the essential practices that would allow the designer to better understand local needs, local communities. His goal were the design for different groups of refugees, their future, instead of planning the ideal refugee camp or the perfect shelter in a way. So after 30 years from its initial design, when we try to reread today its history, we uncovers important aspects of the complexity of protracted refugee situations. The expansion to host more refugees should not be the only reason to investigate long-term needs in the design of the refugee camp. Even when in Agadera, Evenson had been asked to design to meet short-term goals, his approach to design allowed the settlement to transform into something more articulated than a simple, let's say, camp. So thanks to the effort of the community of refugees living in the camp, as well as the flexibility of its spaces, both in practical and very importantly in theoretical terms, well, thanks to those, the camp stopped to be a sort of exceptional landscape. We start to see the seeds of something else, something more powerful. So as the case I show you today explains, the design of camp setup and its increasing complexity and transformation have been interrelated since the beginning, since 1992. So it is through the characterization of the refugee camp as non finito, through the narrative of non finito, that the designer have been able to support, for example, openness to the interpretation, healing, creating new opportunities, creating the possibility of transitioning from temporary solutions to more, I don't want to say permanent because they're not, but for sure to more articulated conditions. Thanks.